for more insight, we welcome to studio Ruthie Bloom, columnist at the Jewish News Syndicate, Dan Perry, former chairman at the Foreign Press Association in Jerusalem, and our very own Eli Hochenberg, host of the show Global Eye. Thank you all so much for being here. The red carpet is normally out for a swearing-in ceremony, but right now the mood in the country is somber, overshadowed by this terror attack in recent hours. Talk to us about your thoughts right now.
Okay, but you know, we have terrorist attacks almost daily, certainly weekly. That this one happened to occur right before the Knesset swearing in is unfortunate, but if anything, it reinforces, as Itamar Ben-Gvir said, reinforces the need for the new government, or at least explains why the public voted for such a right-wing coalition.
Do you agree, Dan?
Certainly, terrorist attacks moved votes to the right. That is clear. Whether the solutions proposed by Mr. Ben-Gvir and his ilk are likely to decrease violence or increase violence is a very open question. And at least half the country, while clearly mourning today's events, also are thinking along a parallel and different track where they are very trepidatious about what is to come because of the right-wing government that's been elected. And I think there is a real concern that reacting to events like today's with more oppression of the Palestinians only risks bringing about another full explosion, maybe even a third intifada.
We've had many situations that have showed that too much care is taken for fear of reprisal, of court-martial, things like that. Now, as I said, I don't think that Ben-Gvir or Smotrich would have solved the problem. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But these things take time, and there is a different, I would say, attitude also towards civilians carrying guns.
I think the viewers should be aware that in the year and a half of the center-left government, more Palestinians were killed by fairly lax open fire rules than in the year and a half that preceded. And the idea of making the rules even more lax as a way of shutting down violence by people who are clearly suicidal, like the attacker today, may not be strategic. And that's really the question. The U.S. has a general currently as defense minister, Lloyd Austin. That's rare in various countries.
Yeah, right.
You don't need to be a defense minister, a general. What you do need to be, what the real choice is between someone who understands the complexities and will be strategic and responsible versus people running around with a canister of gas and a lit match.
He began his spree by showing his license at the roadblock. So, you know, and Gantz wanted to and did increase the number of permits rather than decrease them. And I think that this worldview separates people on the left from the right.
I obviously have to respond to that.
Obviously.
No doubt.
Obviously.
Look, I'm not sure that the idea that increasing desperation will lead to pacification is going to prosper in this region. Neither do I believe that if you give the Palestinians a bit more money and a bit more work permits, that'll be the solution either. Fundamentally, in the West Bank, we have a situation that cannot continue as it is. There is simply no way you can have a not very big part of the world with 3-point-some million Palestinians and 500,000 Jews, where the Palestinians have no political rights for the entity that ultimately governs them, which is not the PA, but Israel, and the Jews do. That clearly is going to lead to violence and misery. And I think Benny Gantz is not necessarily naive about what it takes to oppress people, but rather has a slightly more strategic view about the need to, while giving them hope, also give them like a vista for a future that is less preposterous. And that is the difference between left and right in Israel. The right actually thinks that a bit more repression will take this situation that we have in West Bank that is of a global historic level of ridiculousness and make it somehow acceptable in the long term.
No, I totally disagree with that. It isn't the oppression that's going to solve anything. It is the oppression by the Palestinian Authority of its own people. The day that those leaders are replaced by people who actually care about a flourishing society and an entity, that will be the day that there will be peace between Israel and the PA under any borders, okay? We've seen this again and again. We saw this with the Abraham Accords. The minute that they accept Israel's existence as a Jewish state and as a partner for flourishing economic relations and political relations and exchanges, educational exchanges, then there'll be peace.
You're forgetting that the PA and Israel do not exist on equal terms. The PA is effectively...
Nor should they.
PA is effectively under the boot of Israel.
The terrorist from today, he was killed, okay, actually by a soldier who happened to be there, not by someone who was on duty specifically for that thing. And the family of that terrorist will now receive a huge monthly stipend from the Palestinian Authority for his being a martyr. Netanyahu will not agree to such a thing. That's an example of long-term policy.
Ruthie, this is very, very small potatoes, these sums. Money is fungible. You can't tell which sums go to what. There was a notion of reducing the payments to the family of terrorists from the overall stipend the Palestinians get from Israel. By the way, a lot of it is monies Israel owes the Palestinians because there's taxes collected and customs collected on behalf of the Palestinians. It's a complicated issue. It's not something that determines anything. And Gantz's effort to not deny the Palestinians little sums of money essentially was to keep them afloat, because responsible Israelis, and I do believe that includes Netanyahu, understand that it's in their interest to maintain the PA for the moment as long as they can, because of the security cooperation that to a very great extent prevents attacks like the ones that you had today. This is what I mean. You have to be practical and understand how complex and brittle and combustible is the current situation.
Nobody is more practical than Netanyahu.
Netanyahu is the most conservative.
Exactly. And practical and not quick on the trigger.
Avoiding both war and peace at all costs.
Exactly.
Well, exactly. But I argue that leads Israel in the long term strategically off a cliff.
How are we strategically off a cliff? Look at the amazing accomplishments that we've made in the last few years with the Abraham Accords.
Yeah?
Please answer.
Israel's heading strategically off a cliff because by insisting on more settlement, as this government will do, it creates a mixing of a population in the West Bank that is, at some point, irreversible. And you'll have a country where half the people are Palestinians, 2/3 of which don't have voting rights. That is not a democracy. It's not a viable Jewish state, and it will lead to perpetual conflict and eventual civil war. Now, I don't know, you say Netanyahu is conservative? He is probably conservative enough to not change anything. If Israel doesn't change anything, it is headed off a cliff. Sure as night follows the day.
If I may, it will be very interesting to see whether he maintains this let's call it uber conservative outlook of avoiding war and peace, or tilting either way.
May I suggest an interesting scenario?
Go for it.
Okay.
Only if it's interesting.
But briefly, please, we've got a break coming up.
Look, I agree that Netanyahu understands the things I'm basically saying. He's currently a little bit hostage to a emerging far-right coalition, and I don't think he's so happy with it. Now, in the short term, they may help him cancel his trial with the override clause. Hold on.
Here we go.
I'm sorry, but it's just true. Now, in the longer term, I could absolutely see a centrist government by Likud, Gantz, and Lapid that does real things. Because let us not forget that not 2 years ago or 3 years ago, the Likud accepted the Trump plan for a Palestinian state on 70% of the West Bank.
This terrorist attack reminds all of us that the conflict is still here, alive among us, and there is no, I would say, easy solution. I was just hearing your guest on the studio, and even if you're on the right or even if you're on the left, both of them want to achieve peace, but the ways are very difficult, and it's not depending at all on us, but on the other side.
Here we are amidst coalition talks, and neither one of those negotiating the terms for this coalition is showing any signs of speeding up the process for the sake of finally having this full-on right-wing government. I find that a bit peculiar that none of them is saying, you know what, let's get together, shut the door, and until white smoke is coming out and a coalition built, we're not out.
Dan?
I find it eminently predictable, because if there's one thing that is less credible than what people say during campaigns,
is that they will do the opposite after.
It is what they say during coalition negotiations. Right. So I would ignore everything they say right now and look at who they really are. I'm not sure I agree that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir won the security discourse over poor Eisenkot and Gantz. Eisenkot and Gantz are balanced, experienced, relatively elderly security figures, and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are a bunch of agitators who naturally are going to make more noise. And that is what happened. If you look at the actual results of the election, the Bibi camp and the anti-Bibi camp got about the same number of votes. The reason why we're talking here about a right-wing victory is because 6.5% of the left-wing vote, center-left, was thrown away because of their incompetence in ignoring the electoral threshold and running in a splintered fashion. So I'm not so sure if the people of Israel had a referendum on who they prefer as defense minister, Smotrich or Gantz. I'm not so sure that Smotrich would win.